Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Soul Food Salon. I'm Jeannie Rosner. Those that I don't know, I think I introduced myself, and we can loiter a little bit near the end and get to know each other a little bit better then also. So I started Soul Food Salon about 8 years ago. Our mission is to help educate and inspire us all to live healthier lives. Every year we partner with a different nonprofit. This year we are partnered with eatreal.org. And what they do is they go into schools and school districts and they assess what's in their food, what's in the cafeteria, what food is being distributed to the children, how much sugar is in it, how much trans fat, how the meats are being raised, if it's regenerative farming or whatnot. And they go in and they help kind of navigate. They do an assessment at the school and then they give suggestions and they help them with procuring healthier options. So this year we are partnered with them to help the Morgan Hill School District get Eat Real certified. So this will help us to reach at least 500 schools in California, which is amazing, and up to 120 million meals. So that will be less sugar, less trans fat, just like really amazing. Basically my message, all the food that's healthier will be distributed for the students. So I would love it if y'all would support me on this mission. I realize I don't ask you guys to make any form of payment to come to my events, so this is helpful. This could be, you can consider this your form of payment if you don't mind. So you can go on my website, which is soulfoodsalon.com. In the middle of the main page, the About page, it talks a little bit about our partner, and then there's clear donate here sign. So click on that, and if you don't mind, please make a donation. So far we've raised not a ton, but thank you to those that have made donations. We've raised about $3,500. Our goal is to raise $20,000, so we're pretty shy on the amount that we have raised so far. I'm pretty active on social media, mainly Instagram, and it's Soul Food Salon, all one word. Follow along, please, and share it with others. So today I have the pleasure to introduce you all to Siri Khalsa. So we followed each other on Instagram for a while, and then we now have become real people friends.
Yeah,
real life friends. So she is a medical doctor, triple board certified, which is like crazy, in internal medicine, integrative medicine, and palliative care. Is that right? Lifestyle.
So technically
so
four now.
Four. And then she's also spent 3 years training as an Ayurvedic teacher and practitioner.
Yes.
See this beautiful smile? She's like genuinely as sweet and kind and just generous with her time and her knowledge. We are going to learn a great deal of content today that's really fascinating, and then we're going to taste some really amazing recipes. You have the recipes with you.
Yes.
Right, so enjoy.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for this generous introduction, and I'm delighted to be here. And we're going to be talking about Ayurveda a little bit. I'll do a little more about myself because there's always a little bit of curiosity. And then we're going to do some cooking. Nothing too complicated because in a lot of ways, we're all busy right now, aren't we? It's the holiday season, time is compressing. So we're talking a little bit today about how to use Ayurveda to nourish yourself coming into the new year. And these are things you may have thought about, but we'll try to integrate them within this Ayurvedic framework. And I always like to say this is not a substitute for an Ayurvedic practitioner or your own healthcare provider. The information is really here to just inform you, inspire you. And Ayurveda, for me, has really largely been a journey of self-discovery. And that's the invitation that I'd like to give you today, is to just be curious, even as we're sitting here together. And I'm offering some new ideas. Invite the curiosity, because that single-handedly is how Ayurveda evolved, is through curiosity, through discovery. And in many ways, it's had its own scientific method through thousands of years of discovery, inquiry, revision. And so we can actually say, wow, there's this entire medical system that evolved thousands of years before us now that may not, as I like to say, take a drug off the market in a week, right? We have this modern era where we're innovating at incredible speed, but perhaps it's becoming more and more focused. So Ayurveda gives us a beautiful, broad lens and view. So I don't know about you, but I hit traffic on the 101 coming up. They were like unannounced lane closure. So it was a little hustle and bustle to get here. But I always love to just take a minute for us all to come together into this space. So if you can, in whatever way is comfortable for you, I always like to say both feet on the ground and close the eyes gently. if you're comfortable. If you prefer to have them open, that's okay too. And I'd like for you to just notice your head over your neck. Are you tilting to the left or the right? Is the head forward? Is the head leaning back? And just try to find a nice center point of the head over the center of the body. And just gently noticing your inhale and exhale. And I invite you to just notice with a closed mouth the coolness of the breath as you breathe in through the nose, following the breath, perhaps all the way into the abdomen, expanding the stomach, letting things relax, and then exhaling and perhaps noticing the warmth of the air as it comes out of your nose. Yes, and just taking a moment to notice the inhale and exhale. The coolness of your breath as you inhale, noticing that cool pathway, bringing the air into the lungs, expanding at the diaphragm, and exhaling, noticing the warm breath coming out. Perhaps even just in this moment, creating a gentle intention for yourself, something compassionate and kind, something you want to remind yourself about yourself. And just noticing just that gentle inhale and exhale. And now slowly, as we're coming back into the room, I'd like you to just place your palms over your eyes. Just place the palms gently over the eyes. If your hands are cold, you can rub them together a little bit first, or even put a little energy into the hands as you rub them. Placing the palms over the eyes. And just noticing with that blanket of darkness, perhaps some relaxation in the back of the neck, in the eyes. Another inhale and exhale. We spend so much time on computers and screens, just giving those gentle eyes a rest. And now slowly, just gently, inch by inch, bringing the palms away from the eyes. And when you're about 3 inches out, you can sort of slowly open the eyes, bring the arms down into your lap, wherever. You can even just roll the shoulders, move the body a little. So thank you. I always like to start with kindling Agni, so to speak. And Agni is our digestive fire in the Ayurvedic framework. And when we meditate, we actually kindle Agni. Did you maybe first quickly, who here is familiar with Ayurveda? I'm going to dive in quite a bit more so things make more sense. But this is something I really invite you to do before you eat, before you digest anything. Just take a moment of pause. Let the nervous system integrate into the moment. We're all in motion right now, right? Have you noticed that, particularly in the holiday season? So this is a little bit of overview of what we're going to do in our time together. We'll have an introduction, some theory, and some things that I think are remarkably practical for your day-to-day life. So I think this is one of the things that I love about Ayurveda is that it's actually starting more and more to have clinical correlations to modern scientific theory. Could that be more exciting for someone like me, right? I've been diving into these theories for so long, and it's really powerful to have this opportunity. So as my beautiful introduction came through, I always like to just give a little bit of background, like how the heck did I get to today, right? And also, I'm older than I look, right? So sometimes people try to do the math. They're like, well, how old are you? So full disclosure, I'm 50. And this is something that, right.
You literally look like you're in your 20s.
Exactly, right? Well, COVID was a little rough for me. I admit that, there's been a little weight gain over the COVID period, but basically, one of the things that I came to understand was that this journey was one that I had to invite myself into. And people often ask, well, how did you get started in Ayurveda? This is the most common question. How did you branch out from such a clinical background? And to know me is to know I'm just through and through a scientist. I went to a special magnet school for math and science. My undergrad degree was in biology. I have a master's degree in biology. But my own I'm a perpetual student, so I'm like straight up in the 45th grade. So, which is what you'll often find for people who are in this kind of healing journey and trajectory. And this, I call it growth mindset. You're always learning, you're always discovering, you're always inviting new information and knowledge. And so along the way, I realized very early on in college, I always like to tell this story. I was in a pre-med program. Now, I imagine some of you are doctors and some of you have not as much clinical connection to what it's like, but I was in undergrad at UVA, and it was high stress, right? You're already burning out and you're 18, right? What is that? But I noticed that my system wasn't doing well. The things that should be functioning normally, my cycle, my digestion, my sleep, my mood, all these things started to become really off kilter. I always like to say an early responder, right? This is in the 90s. And I went to the student health clinic, and he gave me the most potent sedative you could possibly think of. And he was like, oh, here's phenobarbital. So here's what I like to say is like, for those of you that don't know, this is like a horse tranquilizer. I'm not actually sure it's used in clinical practice ever, but I always say there are these happy accidents that happen in our life that it was so absurd. And I would encourage you to think back to a moment that to you were like, that's absurd. Why did that happen? And I was like, immediately no. I mean, I'm still the same person I was then, but with a lot of water under the bridge. So I immediately went to like a local health food store. And I said, tell me about digestion. Tell me about how I can make myself healthy. And of course, these principles, Andy Weil and his group, they weren't as prominent then. It wasn't as popular as it is now. So you had to kind of search it out. We didn't have the internet. Those of you that are older doctors that are here with me, we had like Palm Pilots in residency or 4x6 note cards with little holes punched in them. So these were way before the information age. And I just happened to pick up a book on Ayurveda from Dr. Vasant Lad and Amadea Morningstar. And it was Ayurveda basically for self-healing. And I just said, okay, I'm going to try to learn how to cook like this and think like this. And that was the beginning. And that's now, oh gosh, almost 31 years ago now. So it's really just been a weaving, and me always having one foot in and one foot out as I'm sort of thinking, wow, we really focus on disease treatment in the allopathic paradigm, and in these other paradigms, we look at elevating vitality. So these are really conflictual principles, and I always had that tug of war going on inside of me. So initially I did hospice medicine because I just couldn't find my way through the path of how to do that in the clinical practice. But eventually I sort of found my way. And now mainly what I'm doing is mentoring other doctors in their study of Ayurveda, which is really exciting for me because we do two things. One, we look at their own burnout, their own clinical sort of feelings of heaviness and wanting to know more. So I often work with mid to late stage career physicians. And we work on learning these Ayurvedic principles to nourish themselves and then take that into their practice, which is really fulfilling for me, as you might imagine. And I always have to pay homage to my teacher, Dr. Vasant Lad. He's probably one of the primary teachers of Ayurveda in the West. He was born in Pune, India, and he had a teacher basically who encouraged him and said, your destiny, if you will, is in the West. We want you to come take these teachings of Ayurveda that he was very well respected in India. And he settled in Albuquerque for many years. He's now in Asheville. But I studied with him. This is at a clinic in India, and very humble. He also has the allopathic background. So he was an excellent teacher for me. And I'm very much, very blessed, I always say, to have spent all those years with him. So, and I always like to say, this is me coming in, pretty innocent, right? Have any of you recently looked at those little toddler photos where you're like, big smile, you're like, dang, this is easy, right? And then life, right? But I always lamented is that when I was young, we were never given a manual of self-care, right? Now these days with TikTok, God knows what they're all learning. I'm on TikTok to surely just stay aware of what's being shared. But I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I might look into that. And other times I'm like, yeah, that's a big no. But when we were young, many of us in this room, there was no clarity about nourishing ourselves, mindfulness, how to sleep well. We just we winged it, right? And our parents winged it too. And so this was something that was really curious to me. When I started to study more, when I had my own crisis in college, I realized, gosh, there's probably some teachings and some ideas and theories about the steps I could take on a daily basis that would keep my body healthy and nourished, but that I didn't learn any of that in medical school. Like not even, my nutrition course in medical school was laughable. I think the other doctors in here could raise your hand and say, yes, laughable, right? Yeah, laughable. Now these days, I think things have improved. I see most of us are, further along in our careers, trained a while ago. I finished med school in 2002. So it's been a minute, right, since we were in the curriculum phase of our education. So this became sort of important to me. And Ayurveda is very interestingly a critical part of that. And obviously, I'm not going to go into my whole health history with you all today, but suffice it to say, I've had an unusually large amount of health issues. And I always say my body, my spirit's my greatest teacher. It's encouraged me to always go deeper, learn more, understand more. And this is something called Hrid Basti. And I just thought I'd share it with you because it's kind of a fun thing to recognize as we're going along and talking, that Ayurveda is body therapies, it's yoga, meditation, mindfulness, lifestyle. And this is treatments that evolved thousands of years ago. So what you see here is and also in Ayurveda, anything you put on your body, you could literally eat. This is also an interesting idea when you think about all the beauty care and products we put on our body. So this is a whole wheat paste or dough, not unlike if you were making bread, that's rolled into a tube, pressed onto the body, and then a warm medicated oil is placed into that well. And this is particularly helpful for sorrow or heaviness in the heart. So it's a very interesting treatment if you have depression or grief, but also cardiovascular disease. So these things in Ayurveda are just so intricately woven. Now, I don't recommend don't take a statin. So this is that balancing act, right? You find the middle road where you're embracing the modern innovation and pulling from these treatments, therapies, ideas from the past. And I did want to mention, I will be here as long as there are questions after we're done. And so please hold your questions. I know you may have them as we go through. You can jot them down or note them in your mind. We'll do all the questions at the end. So let's talk a little bit about Ayurvedic theory, which is, again, pretty exciting from my standpoint. Has anyone here read the book, Women Who Run with the Wolves? It's kind of an oldie but goodie. If you haven't ever looked at it, it's a great resource. Clarissa Pinkola-Estes is a Jungian psychotherapist, and she offers sort of timeless wisdom, pulling from mythology, stories, and intuition. And I absolutely love this quote from her. She says, "Asking the proper questions is the central action of transformation." And in many ways, this embodies my Ayurvedic perspectives as well, which is, if something is continuing to exist, have you asked the questions that get you deeper into the answer? Maybe you're sort of cycling in the same question, but the answer sits somewhere deeper. A different question would get you towards that answer. And so she offers us a way to kind of critically approach Ayurveda as well, right? We want to be thoughtful in how we approach things. Now, some of you may be familiar with the modern science of epigenetics. Does this ring a bell a little bit? This has become more and more familiar, but epigenetics is, in essence, some of you may remember, I'll step off here for a second, I can't remember, maybe it's the 2000s, we're like, when we get the gene sequence, we're going to be able to solve every disease ever. Do you all remember that in the news and media? And then when we sequenced it far quicker than we thought we would, there was a moment of pause and we said, uh-oh, that's not the whole story. So epigenetics is really the mechanism through which genes are turned on and off. Cancer genes, inflammatory genes, and so I always just take this moment when I'm thinking about this, that there is this miracle of billions of things happening just as we sit here and spend this time together, of these genes being turned on and off, proteins being made, cytokines being made, all of this cellular machinery walking us towards health, walking us away from health. And the beautiful thing about Ayurvedic principles is that any sort of scenario gives you the opportunity to walk yourself a little bit towards health. I always say cure may not be possible, but healing always is, right? So we think about that as for people that have chronic illness sometimes. So understanding that there are various factors that turn these genes on and off has been a really exciting part of modern innovation. And some of the doctors in the room, I'm sure, could speak to their own research and their own discovery. It's like light bulbs went out, especially for people like you who would be here thinking about what would an ancient system of healing have to offer us in terms of science. And so the intersection is really, in many ways, at the epigenetic level, at the autonomic nervous system level, at the circadian rhythm level. This is where we start to realize that our predecessors, the healers of ancient, observed for thousands of years and began to draw theories that just are trends, they're trend lines. And so now we can start to see how science is intersecting with that. This has always been one of my most favorite slides. So some of you who have maybe heard me lecture in some other contexts have seen this slide before. But this is a review, a meta-analysis article that looked at all the places where epigenetic influence exists in our day-to-day life. And though we might think about this, particularly those of you that have studied or looked at lifestyle medicine, it's so powerful to begin to understand that, of course, diet. Most of us know, especially in this wonderful group, that diet is a really important part of health trajectory. But how about seasonal correlations, right? Science is telling us that different seasons affect genes that turn on and off. This could also include cycles of the sun, the time of day, less sun, more sun. We start to sort of examine the rhythm of the day and we realize there's sort of an infinite number of data points that intersect with us. Disease exposure, well gosh, COVID has taught us that, and I'm hoping sincerely we don't have long COVID hasn't deeply impacted you or your loved ones, but we're beginning to understand, what is long COVID? Is it autoimmune? Is it upregulation? Is it viral reservoir we're not finding? It's a curious thing, but I think I saw a study recently that said 1 in 5 people with COVID could ostensibly go on to develop long COVID. So we're in this, and you could go on Twitter, there was a stream recently, and this woman was just vehement. She's like, and there's nothing to do for it. And all of the integrative providers on the planet were like, over here, over here, because we've actually got a few things that will probably help. And again, we're seeing that here. Toxic chemicals, think of all the phthalates, the plastics that are on our planet that interrupt our endocrine system. We think about exposures from drugs of abuse, the fentanyl crisis that's happening. Financial status, you never really thought about that in terms of physical, mental, spiritual health, but we can certainly see food deserts on a practical level. But the stress of finance, gosh, that could probably actually affect epigenetics. What's not here, which I think is sort of in this little area here, is also intergenerational trauma, right? The impact that's happened, generations of poverty, generations of abuse, very complicated impact to epigenetic mechanism. Exercise, I think we all can agree on that. That's kind of standard. Microbiome, we might have a gastroenterologist in the room. We certainly have been at these salons before, but the microbiome is probably one of the most exciting innovations and intersections with Ayurveda. Ayurvedic principles are rooted in digestive health. First place any Ayurvedic practitioner will go with you is your digestion. Literally, there is nothing that's done before that. Any problem you have cancer, you have insomnia, depression, autoimmune disease, skin disease, it doesn't matter. All Ayurvedic practitioners go back and say, what's happening in digestion? And it's actually a very elaborate assessment, more than I want to dive into with you all today. But suffice it to say, it's really powerful. We also understand that therapeutic drugs, things that you have to take, some of them may be, for example, the proton pump inhibitors. Some of you may be following some of the literature on the impact. These are drugs that are taken for reflux, and they might be increasing your risk for a bone fracture or pneumonia or changes in your microbiome. So, but that may be something that someone really needs, like life is miserable without their reflux medicine. So we begin to understand, like, okay, all of modern living probably has some intersection. I think the one that's really been relevant to me recently is our social isolation from the pandemic, right? Seeing a lot of nods with that. It's so powerful to think about feeling lonely as an independent risk factor for death, on par with, I think they said smoking 13 or 7 cigarettes a day, someone correct me. But that's powerful if you think about the fact that if someone is lonely, it's almost the equivalent of smoking a half pack of cigarettes a day. That tells you, well, what is that, right? It's different than eating a bad diet. It's different than smoking cigarettes. What's happening? It's an epigenetic mechanism. It's something that the lack of, is it oxytocin? Is it energy? Is it, we don't know. We don't really understand. But this is something that the pandemic has really illuminated. We're really seeing, you know, there's corollaries, right? Perhaps someone is not as engaged. They don't eat as well. They don't sleep as well, right? We're so interconnected in these health metrics. So I love this slide. It's a great reminder. And I always love to point out, too, the work of Dan Buettner. And if, just as an aside, these are things that could overlay into an Ayurvedic map. So I always like to start with things just as reminders that, oh, wait, this is also deeply held in Ayurvedic principles. So quick show of hands, who's familiar with the blue zones? Oh, awesome. Okay, so good audience here. Just in case you're not familiar, Dan Buettner was a National Geographic, I wanted to say initially photographer, but I think he was a reporter, and he was tasked with finding the healthiest people on the planet. Maybe it was some random news article, right? This is this happy accident. And what happened is he identified these core places on the earth. In Ikara, Greece, Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, Italy, Loma Linda, which is where the Seventh-day Adventists are, and the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica. And these days, he's actually creating Blue Zone communities. There's actually one in Monterey, which is really kind of interesting. And they're running the program through Salinas, which I happen to know because I'm living in Gilroy, so I'm kind of further down the peninsula. As I was driving up this morning, I was like, gosh, this could be 1/3 of the way to LA. like it's a decent drive up here. So, and then the traffic, so gotta love it. But at any rate, so these are the sort of 9 core areas that he felt were the metrics, the pieces that kept longevity. Now, a lot of us think about lifespan, but I also want you to think about health span, right? This quality of maintaining your vitality, your interconnectivity to your world, and your functional capacity for as long as possible. And interestingly, this was what he found were some of the features for people who maintained that. They're 100 years old and still walking to the market, getting their food. Well, what were the features of this group that kind of maintained and sustained their health? And again, we could think about these things in this Ayurvedic framework, but moving a sense of purpose, how powerful to think about an epigenetic mechanism that comes when you wake up in the morning and you say, I got this, I want to do this is exciting. Really different than when you wake up and think, oh, not so sure. So I often would work with people and say, you know, what gives you meaning? What gives you a sense of purpose? That's medicine to me, even though that's not popular. That's not something you can chart an ICD-9 for. Lack of purpose, no. But when you start looking at this constellation of all these data points that create and maintain health, not having purpose is one that's actually pretty significant for people. Downshift, right? Kind of like we did when we all come together. I just took 2 minutes to help us downshift into being here together, because this is community, this is connection, this is healing, this is medicine. And I think that's what I just so value about the work that you do. The 80% rule, again, this is that not lingering in perfection around kind of how you're living, eating. Plant slant, of course, plant-forward diets seem to be the ones that most of us, I don't get into arguments anymore around macros. So, people can choose the way they want, but having plants in your diet, we all mostly can agree, is an important feature. Wine at 6 or wine at 5. The alcohol piece is one I think we're just still discovering, right? There's some data recently that suggests that daily consumption of alcohol may not be as beneficial as we thought. So I just encourage people to stay curious around how they wind down. There are other ways to wind down. Even, being out in nature, being in the sunset, letting the sunrise and sunset, as we'll talk about. Loved ones first, the right tribe, sense of belonging. You can see here that a lot of these are linked to thoughts, feelings, and emotions, not as much the intake, things we're bringing into our body. So I thought this was really fascinating because this overlays into Ayurvedic principles as well. Of course, some of you may be familiar with the lifestyle medicine 6 pillars, which I always like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dr. Ornish, who's a wonderful teacher and has brought many of these principles of lifestyle medicine, his primary teacher was Swami Satchidananda. And Dr. Ornish tells the story of how he came home from medical school deeply depressed. He thought, what am I doing? And his sister had invited this Indian teacher. They had a salon, and the teacher said, well, gosh, life isn't meant to be lived like this. Let me share a few things with you. This is the early 70s, so way before any of this was popular, and gave him many of the principles that came into his programs and into his research. And as many would acknowledge, he's sort of the grandfather of lifestyle medicine, his principles, his research. So managing stress, form and maintain relationships, restorative sleep, avoiding risky substances, healthful eating, and physical activity. So perhaps as I've shared these 3 slides, you start to see this, that health is a constellation of things. It's not just the diet, it's not just movement, it's sleep, it's connectivity, it's purpose. There are many different facets that actually exist. This is Dr. Ladd. Again, this was on one of our trips in India. But he says, according to Ayurvedic principles, by understanding oneself, identifying our own constitution, recognizing sources of doshic aggravation, again, some technical terms, one cannot only follow proper guidelines to cleanse, purify, and prevent disease, but to uplift oneself into a realm of awareness previously unknown. So in many ways, Ayurveda is also a medicine of awareness. Doesn't that sound interesting, right? What's that mean? And it's not just mood regulation, it's inner discovery, compassion, empathy, finding your sense of purpose, feeling alive in that sense of purpose, and creative in that sense of purpose, right? It's one thing to be like, ideas, and then no energy for execution. Some of us might have had that problem from time to time. So, as I like to say. And I always say, I love to kind of give you some visuals as we're entering some of these principles into our vocabulary. Ayurveda translates quite simply as the science of life. Now, boy, that's a big, bold term, right? The science of life. But what I wanted to sort of point out is that each of these could be some aspect of life intersecting with you. Perhaps even just this beautiful weather. Do you ever notice, this morning we thought, oh, it's a great day to be outside. It's a great day to go somewhere. And the last few days, it's rainy and heavy, but I was in Phoenix for 17 years. So, 2 days ago, I was like, yay, rain and clouds. It helps my migraine. So, this is definitely something to recognize, is that if you wanted to just sort of imagine yourself intersecting with all the different pieces of your life, how you woke up, what you had for breakfast, who you're going to talk with, who you're going to connect with. All these things create this constellation. So then we come back to, well, what exactly is Ayurveda, right? So it's the science of life. And as I like to point out, it's kind of this interplay of the inner world, our inner milieu, the outer world, and then all these genes and epigenetics doing their thing. So modern science will get there, I'm convinced, right? Tricorder reality, I'm a Star Trek fan. You know, every time I see the tricorder, I'm like, maybe not in my lifetime, but it will come. We will have that level. And I don't know if you all have paid attention this last week, there's a lot of this AI stuff happening. Like it's coming quicker than we probably realize, the ability to integrate data about health and wellness. And as we incorporate all the wearable information, we'll begin to see all these data points that change sleep patterns, heart rate variability, you know, you name it, glucose monitoring. So I actually remain optimistic about the intersection of technology with Ayurvedic principles, because really they were elaborate AI in the past. They didn't have the distractions that we do now. So the purpose of Ayurveda, I love this, it really helps us. So first I wanted to point out, when you're studying Ayurveda, you're given a Sanskrit passage because it comes from India. The science of Ayurvedic principles come from India. They started probably, no one's totally sure, but thousands of years ago, and are written into these Sanskrit sutras that you're then given a transliteration, and then hopefully you have a good Sanskrit scholar who's going to pull this principle into the poetry that is held in Sanskrit language. So the idea here is that we're going to help the healthy person to protect and maintain his health, and help a diseased person to become healthy and stay healthy forever. Now this second one, I think we're actually pretty good at in Western medicine. We're doing better and better. We have methods, but helping the healthy person to protect and maintain his swasthya, which is establishment in health. It's not just this abstract thing. So this is the idea of understanding this philosophy. I'm not going to spend too much time on this particular slide, but this is the origins of Ayurveda from Sankhya, which is a Vedic body of philosophy. And the idea here is that sorry, this is actually super complicated, but like, I'm not going to actually spend too much time on this because honestly, it requires quite a bit of background and understanding Vedic philosophy. But the idea here is just understanding that there is a universal theory of how things come into form, and that there's a static element and an active element, almost like you might see in traditional Chinese medicine, a yin and a yang. And in that formation phase, earth becomes clearer and clearer, and consciousness becomes clearer and clearer, until we find ourselves with the 5 elements. And that's really the primary theory from which Ayurvedic principles are derived. These are the classic Ayurvedic texts, and I always like to throw this slide in here for the scientists and scholars. And you can see that this is actually a huge body of knowledge that you're asking yourself to come into a connection with. Umay Harrison's internal medicine was this thick, and this is all Sanskrit. I didn't become fluent in Sanskrit. I refer to the English translations. But to understand that there was an advanced body of knowledge, some of which dates, there are 3 primary textbooks, Charaka Samhita, Sushruta Samhita, and Ashtanga Hridayam. These are the 3 primary textbooks from which most of what you've probably seen online or in some context have come from. And then Dr. Ladd's writings are these 3 books, which are really, I call them commentary on the classics. So these 3 books give us a modern day interpretation. They're a wonderful resource. You can find them on Amazon. So let's talk a little bit about this 5-element theory. And this is sort of the basis. So some of you may have studied a little bit of Ayurveda and done a little quiz. Has anybody ever done the dosha quiz? Right, yeah, and it's kind of like, wait, but that's this and this is that. So what happens, and I'll explain how we get from the 5 elements to the 3 doshas here in a moment. But the 5 elements of Ayurveda were really initially structured on observation, kind of like Dan Buettner, kind of like lifestyle medicine or modern science. They began to look at the world around them. And these 5 elements all gave some context of understanding themselves, ourselves. So from the earth standpoint, it contains static, heavy, dense. It's the earth element. If we think about the water element, of course, some of these are really, it's not quite like Chinese medicine, which is a little bit more poetic in the 5-element theory. These are pretty practical. Water is providing lubrication in the body. It's in the joints, in the lungs, it's in the uterus, many different places. It provides lubrication. The fire element is responsible for transformation. Of course, we know it as cooking on stoves or the sun, or perhaps even here in the Northern California area as, really something to be very wary of, the fire element. The air element is movement. So when the wind blows, but it's also movement in the body, the movement of air in the lungs, the movement of propagation of a nerve impulse, the movement of urine through the ureters is this quality of air. And ether is this quality of the container or spaciousness. Ether is often the hardest one to understand, but sort of the same way we have to have a room in which we're all existing here together. There's a space that's holding us all here together. So these 5 elements can be observed externally, but they can also be observed in food, in your environment. They can be observed in the person sitting next to you. They can be observed in different quantities, if you will, in people around us. So if we think about these 5 elements in the body, we'll just go through these quickly, but the earth element is in the same way earth holds us in her embrace, the earth element within us holds us together. The water element is responsible for secretions, mucus, plasma, cytoplasm, membranes. The fire element, we see this as metabolism or enzymatic reactions or transformation that's happening in the body. Even the processing of this information is in the Ayurvedic framework using fire element. The vayu, the air component, is the quality of movement, as I had mentioned, movement of air, movement of a baby out of the body. And akash is the space, so the space in the mouth, the oropharynx, the GI tract, the thorax, the capillaries. So we can see this interrelationship. And I always love to say that the poets and mystics all have a relationship to the 5 elements, right? We can lean into this sort of exploration that's happened. This is a poem from John Burroughs, or a quote from John Burroughs, and he says, "To find the universal elements enough, to find the air and water exhilarating, to be refreshed by a morning walk or an evening saunter, to be thrilled by the stars at night, to be elated over a bird's nest or a wildflower in spring. These are some of the rewards of the simple life." So this quality of just becoming curious about the elements around you and the elements within you is part of understanding Ayurveda. So within this theory, if you will, and the way that I like to explain this is that sometimes we need patterns to understand things, right? You walk into the closet, you see 5 gray pants and 3 yellow shirts, and you think, gray pants look good with yellow shirts, right? We have the patterns that we've created. Or you walk into a market and you see 14 apples and 12 oranges, right? You begin to say, oh, citrus and fruit is good. We begin imprints of life around us. And in the Ayurvedic framework, each of us are made up of various, if you could say, ratios of these elements. Some have a little more, some have a little less. But we had to start to develop a terminology that gave us the ability to recognize the patterns to be able to shift and change them. So classically we say, water and earth create kapha, water and fire create pitta, and earth and air create vata. So let's take a look here. Okay, so we'll keep it, I always like to distill it into things that feel super practical. So can anyone tell me who this is? Audrey Hepburn, right? Now, good gravy, what's happening right there, right? But this is an interesting thing, is that if you compare Audrey Hepburn to, say, Oprah or Priyanka Chopra, there's no way that their bodies, which hold more of the earth and water element, and this body, which holds more of the air and ether element, are the same, right? So our modern conceptualization of women is really for women that have a lot of air and ether, or a lot of vata. But if you're a more earth and water person, your body can never look like this. I find this so paradoxical that we haven't figured out how to say there are some terminologies, mesomorph, ectomorph, endomorph. You may have heard those terms, somewhat similar to this conceptually. But what happened in the Ayurvedic framework and how they developed these ideas is that what they realized is that they could have 100 people in front of them, and there'd be so many differences between them. And you start to sort of be able to clump people into categories, and a little bit more of that grounded, steady, static, thick earth element. Well, that's going to be like The Rock, right? Who's 50 this year, so he's kind of a fun guy. And of course, but he's sort of, he may be on steroids, right? Which brings more of the earth element. But this guy, but we also think about this idea that also, for example, Oprah has talked about her weight struggles for most of her life. It's a little bit easier for people with more of the earth element to maintain and hold that earth element in their being versus this thin vata person, air and ether element, for whom they might eat the same amount as their kapha friend, this air and earth and water friend, and the earth and water friend holds the earth and water element, and the vata person is like, yeah, bye-bye. So, it's very interesting to see how the interaction of these different body types actually gives us a roadmap to understand how we might respond to various foods, even various other people. So if we take a look at these 5 elements again, air and ether, so we think about air like a hummingbird maybe, thin-boned, kind of like creative, very joyful they can be. They can be sort of up in the clouds, pulling in creativity. Can anyone tell me which tennis player this is?
Djokovic.
Yeah. So, he had a very particular style, right? Quick, there's this quality in him. So think of the hummingbird, this air and ether element as being quick and creative and kind of really resourceful. Then we get into the fire and water element. So this, she's bringing a little bit in too, but this is the Twilight series, so we think about fire and water as the tiger as a possible analogy, this kind of on the earth, but like very dynamic, kind of stronger muscle build than this air and ether person. They often have a lot of luminosity because of that fire element, so their eyes are kind of glowing, which I thought he was a good example because, he's like a vampire in all these movies. So, but we think about these different qualities of Pitta can also be sort of a fiery personality or spicy in what they say. And if you've ever heard Ryan Reynolds in his Deadpool movies, he's got a lot of sarcasm and that's more of this fiery kind of quality. And then we think of this earth and water element. They often have very full features. Their eyes are wider, their body's wider. There's more flesh on the body that's like, you can't manage, that's how it's been built. And because of that, though, the earth element gives a sense of peacefulness and joy and support and connectivity. So what we begin to understand is that, let's say you're building a team, boy, each of these pieces of the team could be really interesting. You have your vata person, the air and ether element, who brings ingenuity, creativity, joyfulness, levity. Your pitta person who's like, all right, I'm gonna get it done. We're gonna execute that plan. And your kapha person who's like, okay, everybody, we got this, circle in, big hug, let's do it. So, again, we all have bits and pieces of these elements within us. And so I've offered you some Hollywood versions to just give you a way to kind of mentally connect with these kind of foreign terms, especially if you're not as familiar with Ayurveda. So these doshas, vata, pitta, and kapha, are responsible for psychological, spiritual processes, physiological processes. And they create the basis for our mind, body, and spirit. Again, we don't have a framework at all. If you go into like neuroscience and deep dive into consciousness, you're like, whoa, we don't get it at all. Like there's very little, the neuroscience of consciousness is very complex and reductionist. So I like to think of it in a kind of different framework. But these qualities of the doshas describe all the actions that are happening within the body. So this is kind of what I wanted to offer you in terms of this introduction to Ayurveda, is this appreciation that the elemental nature is something that exists around us. And of course, Ayurveda can get very complicated very quickly. So hopefully you have a little taste of what these Ayurvedic principles mean and why did these patterns evolve? Why did these principles evolve, this inner world and outer world connectivity? And so, as I mentioned, these sort of minute and gross intersections with our inner and outer world impact our health. But we're seeing that now from the microbiome research, from circadian rhythm research, from neurohormonal surges. Again, really fascinating stuff. So let's talk a little bit about daily steps. And this is where I like to get really granular and really practical with some things that you can take home today. One of the things that I think is rarely talked about in an office visit with your doctor, and that is, how's your intuition? Right? Has a doctor ever asked you that? No, probably not. I was always a little unusual in my practices. So, you know, that moment when you're like, how's your intuition doing? And then, you know, gentle pause. Yeah, okay, let's go with that. But for me, it's a really valuable gauge because it tells me about your creativity, your initiative, your self-trust, your ability to sort of carry out things. Because in the Ayurvedic model and in the lifestyle medicine model, it's a lot of small data points of behavior change, right? Some of you may have had a consult with someone who focuses on these principles and you realize, I gotta change how I sleep, okay, or how I wind down at night. I got to add more plants to my diet. I need to 10,000 steps, and I got to get rid of all the chemicals in my home and not be around secondhand smoke. And I better have self-love and lots of community. Like suddenly that list, and when I was first really in practice, I'd be like, here's your handout with 85 things to do. People would come back and they'd be like, I didn't do any of them. And I realized like I'm just like overexcited and perhaps even a little overzealous about what can be accomplished. And so what I realized is that small actionable steps were really the key. And there's these SMART goals. Some of you may be familiar with that concept as a clinician, but really meeting someone with a sort of adventure and curiosity is what I found worked well. Meaning sometimes people, and even as you're sitting listening to me and as we go through these next ones, you might have a little inner voice that's not anyone else's thought. It's purely your thought. And I always encourage you to sort of do a check-in from time to time. Is that my thought or is that someone else's thought for me? I have had a lot of other people's thoughts for me that I've worked out, as you might imagine. We all do in our own way. But through meditation, mindfulness, creativity, I've become a little bit clearer in, oh, that's actually my thought. So the intuition is something that is actually cultivated through lifestyle choices, especially from the Ayurvedic standpoint. And fine-tuning intuition actually gives you one of the best compasses for navigating your own health, which I think is really valuable. So because Ayurveda explores all aspects of life, exercise, mindfulness, many of you may have had a breath work or pranayama practice or yoga, patterns of sleep. We also have our interconnectedness to nature, which is one of my favorite medicines, being in nature. Nutrition, as we've alluded to, self-care, community. If we kind of take a step back and we take a look at this concept of daily self-care, believe it or not, no surprise here, but Ayurveda actually has a term for that, a central term. So first thing you do is you look at digestion, and the next thing you do is you look at the daily routine. And this is the key. These are the keys to health. It's actually really simple, I would say. It's not super complicated. And I always like to take a lot of the big terms out so that you can just have it be really practical, make it make sense. So the dinacharya is basically your daily routine. And this is the idea behind this, is that you're attuning your lifestyle. Maybe you are a high power executive. You travel all the time, you're a go-getter, and you know that that's going to take a toll on your body. Well, Ayurveda gives you tools to balance you as you're on the go. Maybe you do an oil massage, or you have medicated herbs specific to your body type. You don't eat as much once the sun sets. There's strategies, right? So oftentimes people will say to me, that's not very Ayurvedic, is it? And I say, oh, but yes. Actually, everything is, because as you may recall, as I said, it's the science of life, right? It's the science of all things. So though it may not be an Indian dish from India, or it may not be yoga or mindfulness, there are ways in which your life is your medicine, and that is Ayurveda. That's Ayurveda. And you probably know what they are. We all do, that little intuitive voice that says, remember that thing when you did that? And, so for example, in the Ayurvedic model, if you have a lot of that air and ether element, the Vata body type, and I always use my family as an example because I can. So I don't want to out anybody else, but in my family, so I have, my mom is 80. She's kind of in her own way, the picture of health, except for one thing. She is a very Vata person, and she has not exactly balanced her Vata. So her primary health issue is her brittleness, her bones. So Vata people can tend to feel a little dried out, like a tree that's lost its sap, so to speak. Now, the thing about it that's kind of ironic is that if you have a lot of air and ether, you want to sort of have a balancing quality of earthy things, unctuous things, nourishing things, not things that are necessarily dry or crisp. Does that make sense when you think about this analogy of the tree? So I was in Phoenix visiting my mom for Thanksgiving, and she's on her Instacart order, and she's like, I want those crispy, dry flax crackers from Trader Joe's or Sprouts or wherever. And I was like, okay. You can only go so far, right? I mean, she knows, but she still desires this thing that's going to, in the Ayurvedic model, perhaps bring some more imbalance to her. But the idea here is that you can observe sometimes the things we crave are really good and appropriate, and sometimes the things we crave are not. So another example of that would be, so I'm a Pitta Kapha kind of predominant person, which means I'm primarily fire, water elements. And so I'm, in many ways, Pitta people tend to have a drive. A lot of doctors are primarily Pitta because it just takes a lot of energy and self-assuredness and metabolism of information to get through the medical journey. But let's say I was an executive, right? Let's say I had a high power position and I decided that I wanted to go for a run in the middle of Phoenix in the summer. So it's 110 degrees out and I'm going for a run. And I come back from the run and I get a margarita and a chimichanga with hot sauce with habanero sauce. So I'm bringing this alcohol, fire, external environment, heat into my life, and I go home that night and I'm like, I'm angry and I've got a rash and I've got reflux and I don't understand why. So this idea is that I'm exaggerating, but not totally, right? Not totally. So when you begin this journey of discovery, you begin to see little breadcrumbs like, oh, yeah, that plane trip I took, and then my bowels weren't regular, and then I had some insomnia, and now my depression and anxiety is worse. Oh, there's a thread here. There's some breadcrumbs here that I can enjoy, like a mouse going back and nibbling and exploring. So, we become our best detective. We become our best explorer in that context. So this dinacharya is creating resilience using, and I'm particularly today going to focus on circadian rhythms because I think this is really cool stuff. Some of you may follow Andrew Huberman's work. He's here in Stanford. He is like, I'm convinced he studied Ayurveda at some iteration of his being because his work parallels so beautifully with Ayurvedic principles. So he has a podcast called Huberman Lab. And if any of you know him, high five from me. So, because it's really helped people like me who have been sort of walking this path of these things are really valuable. And here he's coming along with a lot of science and really spending a lot of time on these podcast episodes. So again, as we've sort of alluded to, these lifestyle goals are what can guide us. So this is, and I think that Dr. Huberman's lab is a neuro-optics. So their primary focus is looking at light. He even did a post today that references something I'm going to have here. But this is Sachin Panda's work, and this is he's at the Salk Institute, and this is he calls it the circadian clock or the circadian code. And as opposed to giving you a lot of complicated Sanskrit sutras, this is Ayurveda, folks. This is exactly principles you would find in Ayurveda. So the idea here, and this is based on his research of what gives optimal circadian rhythm. And these steps are really straightforward and very practical, and you can see effects almost immediately. That's what's exciting about it. So if you weren't doing some of these things and you implemented it in your life, within 2 to 3 weeks, you could actually feel more intuitive, more creative, more energized. You might see your weight change. Circadian rhythm is intricately linked to weight. Anyway, so the first principle is to avoid eating 1 hour after waking up. I always use the analogy of, has anyone been to Colonial Williamsburg by any chance? Yes. I'm from the East Coast. So do you remember the pilgrim, and then he's got the bellows on the fire? He's got the old-fashioned fireplace. So they wake up in the morning. Think of your digestive fire as embers when you wake up in the morning, like this old pilgrim. And he gets this bellows thing, and he starts putting air onto the fire and a little kindling. And slowly those flames wake up, and then it's ready to cook food. It's ready. Think of your internal digestion not unlike that. That if we eat as soon as we wake up, it's only embers, and we need that heat and that fire for our digestive capacity. They also talk a bit about time-restricted eating with the peak meal at the peak of the sun. Also very Ayurvedic. If you think about, the sun is in the mid-heaven, and that's the fire element. So this connectivity of the fire element within us to the mid-heavens. So sometimes the nature just gives us all the cues we need. So the recommendation in Ayurveda and in this body of work is the larger meal when the sun is at its peak, its zenith, which is really kind of fun. When you start making that shift, you do actually notice a little more energy, you sleep a little deeper, you have more ease with bowel movements, which if you ever do work with Ayurveda, you will come to know. Bowel movements, yes, such an important part of the therapeutic process. We want to see exposure to light. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. And this sort of wind down quality, we'll talk a little bit more about that too, but putting the phones onto dimmer, having lights on dim, candlelight in the evening, or wearing the blue light blocking glasses, limiting caloric intake so that again, we don't want to necessarily wake up all the fires right before we're going to bed. The body's going to respond. It diverts energy, at least from the Ayurvedic principles, from resting deeply. And we know we are a sleep-deprived nation. Deep sleep is something many of us are needing to work on. And so this is his body of work. And boy, this is different than yet the blue zones, and it's different from yet lifestyle medicine, but this is Ayurvedic, 100%. All these principles, every single thing in this clock, if you will, are held in the Ayurvedic textbooks. So again, if you wanted to just screenshot that, that's a summary of it, but 8 hours in bed, and I'm as guilty as you all. That means no phones. So, do what you can. Sometimes I have to plug the phone in another room to really create the boundary. I mean, we had to acknowledge, we are in this digital age, and the light input really impacts melatonin secretion. This consistent window. Some people, again, depending on your metabolic fire, if you're a fiery pitta, this water and earth elements, you may need a little more food than other people do. So recognize that these are generalizations, but working within your own observations. Like, do you get migraines? Do you get headaches? Do you feel lightheaded? That's not working then. That's not a good equation for you. And I always come back to one of the biggest things that I learned from Dr. Ladd is this quality of, it's a strong way to say it, but ahimsa of nonviolence to self. And that is actually one of the main ways that we build and maintain ojas, this quality of cellular intelligence, is through kindness and compassion to self. And so I don't want anyone leaving here with this mindset of, I have to. Because these are thoughts that can divert you from feeling compassionate to yourself. You can really just, I choose to, or I'm going to. But this quality of urgency is very pitta. It's our pitta quality, this urgency quality. So I have to. Anything that I'm offering you is not meant to be an I have to. I want to plant that seed, intersect that thought before it becomes prominent. So we're starting to wind down the lecture here. So from the first aspect we're looking at is light. And light as medicine, right? What a powerful idea that light itself is medicine. And this is an Ayurvedic sutra. And the idea here is, now I'm not asking you all to do this, I'm just offering the principles. But it says the healthy person gets up from bed at Brahmi Muhurta, that is before dawn or around 45 minutes before sunrise, 5 to 6 a.m., knowing that these last 3 hours of the night from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. is known as Brahma Muhurta. So the idea here, this is thousands of years old, is that being awake in the pre-dawn hour might be of some health benefit. Okay, so what's some modern science that we could look at as a correlation to that? So this is from Huberman's work, but basically this morning light concept is probably his banner. If you listen and follow his work at all, morning light is literally, in his purview, the most critical thing we can do for our health. Well, how is that possible? So morning light works through these melanopsin-expressing ganglion cells. The light simulates these retinal ganglion, sensitive ganglion cells, which start this body of information that goes into the brain, basically, optic flow. And these are involved in non-image forming visual processes, such as light reflex and circadian entrainment, and contribute to visual perception. So these are these particular cells in the eyes. But he talks about it specifically as early morning light or late afternoon light, which is really interesting because there's a specific color of the blue in the sky that's happening in those hours that really entrains these processes. So though daylight at any time of day is valuable, there's a particular value at sunrise and sunset, which is, I find, really fascinating because these are principles that have been espoused over time. So when this yellow-blue contrast is at its highest, it tends to wake things up. And this activates these pathways, which are the circadian rhythm generators of the body. Think about a master messaging process. It tells sex hormones to be made, it tells melanin to be made, it tells cortisol to be made, it helps dopamine pathways. All that from the simplest act of just being outside in the early morning sun. That was usually my first piece of medicine for people in my practice. Would you do me a favor and just be outside in the early morning sun if it's possible in your routine and in your world? And then in doing this, I always say, a lot of us have this misnomer of mind over matter, right? We're gonna just push through, we can do it. But why not let the matter inform the mind, right? Why not let these pathways, these lifestyle choices, be the things that impact our process of how we think? So, and again, my best piece of advice for you is how we sleep, our deep sleep, actually starts with how we start the day. And I used to tell people that the moment you wake up, you're setting your, if you get that early morning light exposure, you're gonna set up your melatonin surge 12 hours later. That's pretty cool, right? No supplements needed, totally free. I love things that are totally free because isn't that awesome, right? Because integrative providers, functional medicine, Ayurvedic, there's a list of things that you might buy, supplements and other things that support the body, but I'm all in for the things that are completely free. Now this is, again, we're kind of moving towards the last few slides here, but this was a beautiful study from the Harvard Sleep Clinic at the beginning of the pandemic. And I wanted to just point out their study of circadian rhythm is pretty pronounced, right? These are theoretically some of the experts in the world. So, and if anybody wants a copy of this paper, I apologize, the reference isn't here. You can reach out to me on social media, Dr. Siri Chand, or through my website, same thing. So I'll happily send you a copy of this paper. It's one of my favorites. But basically what they said, which I thought was very interesting, is they said, get bright light exposure during the day, create a consistent schedule of social interaction at the same time each morning. So they were noticing that rhythmic relationship, meaning doing things at the same time, actually was going to promote circadian rhythm health. Work out around the same time each day and avoid being sedentary. We didn't talk much about that, but sedentary is the new smoking. Dim the lights and switch to quiet activities in the evening. It helps tell your body it's time to sleep. So this relationship to circadian rhythm is actually really powerful. Okay, so we're about to switch over into some food parts. One of the things that Ayurvedic teachings have this emphasis on is maintaining and nourishing ourselves. And interestingly enough, it's going to be a little bit different for everyone. It may even vary from the Ayurvedic standpoint based on how you slept the night before, whether you've traveled, how your bowels are doing, all kinds of variables. So it's a kind of day-by-day adjustment. I just encourage people, be curious, notice, make some small adjustments and see how things shift or change. But this is, again, I wanted to just share with you a sutra from Ashtanga Hridaya. And it says here, one should always consume proper quantity of food. Right amount of food activates Agni, which is this digestive capacity. Food that are light to digest, lagu, and foods that are hard to digest, guru, these are the Sanskrit terms, both require a specific quantity for proper digestion. As a rule, if food is heavy to digest, food such as oily foods, meat, fish, sweets, it should be consumed till half of the satiation levels achieved. Are the sohitya, if the food is light to digest, it should be consumed till one is not overly satiate, not adi truptata. So again, this is a very interesting series of instruction, and how does this translate, right? You may refer to it as food coma. So have you noticed you just had your holiday celebration and even now you're still feeling a little sluggish after you eat? Like, I'm right here. So we did a plant-based vegetarian holiday celebration, and you just inevitably overeat. It's just like I don't even know. Like one of these years I'm gonna be like, I'm not gonna do it this year. But and then I notice for me, because my digestion is one of my absolute weak points, that I'm still sluggish now after meals, almost 2 weeks later, right? So almost it's like, you begin to appreciate that over-consuming, and I always add in the standard American diet, under-nourishing, over-consuming. Bad combo, but it's what a lot of people, I don't think this room, but many Americans are over-consuming nutrient-poor calories. It's a bit of a paradox. So this idea here is that, just be curious. Again, notice heavier foods in your digestion and lighter foods. So some foods, you kind of feel that food coma afterwards, and you're like, okay, maybe I can still eat that, but I need to do a little bit less, and I need to have some ginger tea after the meal, some other things that I could do. So as I mentioned, people always say, well, that's not very Ayurvedic, and I say, oh, but it is, because it all is. There's nothing that's not. So, at any rate. So we have a couple of recipes we're going to explore today. And I've had, Jean has gratefully helped me. And we have recipes for vitality, as I like to say. We have a chai tea. And I think what I'll do is I'll just talk about it here. That'll work. So the chai tea recipe, and I think you all have it in your sheets here. My initial foray into food photography and blogging was my right brain expression when I was really knee deep in practice, which of course I'm not at this point, but the blog was a creative outlet. So this slow cooker chai has ginger, clove, cinnamon, peppercorns, fennel, cardamom, and star anise. And one of the things that happens in Ayurvedic cooking is that you're really figuring out how to nourish. Now remember the pilgrim with his bellows, right? We want this full and robust fire in the midday. We want this, you know, you've seen it, right? The fire in the fireplace that just feels super healthy and vibrant, and you're like, I could put a log on that, no problem, right? So we want to think about how to nourish that. So this chai is actually, it doesn't have caffeine in it. You could put a little black tea, but again, some of the air and ether types might notice a little bit more movement with that. But what the chai does is it's something you can start your day with. So let's say you kind of want to have something that starts the engines, right? Chai is like kindling, or the bellows, the air. So you just think about this chai tea recipe. We love to do it in our slow cooker overnight. It really does two things. One is that these ingredients are very expensive. They really add up quickly. But if you do it in the slow cooker, you can use less ingredients. You boil it overnight. It makes a beautiful, rich flavor. You really pull out all the flavors. So that's number one. And number two, from the Ayurvedic standpoint, longer cooking has an energetic quality as well, which of course we don't have any reference points for that in Western nutrition, but it has an unexpected quality of being very nourishing. And typically with the chai, you can add a sweetener. Now, as you might imagine, when you start diving into Ayurveda a little bit more, it's like, whoa, okay, my eyes are spinning a little, because depending on your body type, might depend on what type of sweetener you use or what type of plant milk you use. I don't want to make it too complicated for you, but just suffice it to say that differing sweeteners may have different impacts on the body. Maple syrup is a little different than honey. But again, you know, go with what feels good. We have maple syrup as a sweetener today. The other thing we can think about that I think is really interesting in the viral season, right? Cough, cold, COVID, flu. These all have antiviral, antibacterial, antifungal qualities, and they're potent antioxidants. So, and there's myriad of micronutrients and phytonutrients in these particular spices. And most of them are seeds or bark or roots. So these are things that are very potent and strong when decocted or brewed over time. Herbal teas, which are the leaves and flowers, oftentimes if you boil them overnight, all the essence boils off. All those beautiful oils just, you know, float out into the ceiling, into the house. You wake up, you're like, oh, it smells so good. But then you taste the tea and it's a little bland. So again, usually for the teas and flowers, we would boil the water, put them in, cover it, and steep it, and use it almost immediately. So I just want to point out that not all teas do well being boiled overnight, but when you're using seeds, roots, and bark, it's okay. It really takes time to extract that energy out. So that's our first recipe. And second one is, this is a fun one. This is the pomegranate and persimmon salad. Now, one of the things in Ayurveda when it comes to, and I'm going to do a little bit of demonstration here in a minute, but just to talk briefly, one of the things that's interesting in Ayurveda is that there are 6 tastes in Ayurveda, 6 tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, pungent, and astringent. Now, astringent is one that we are not as familiar with culturally, and bitter we tend to avoid. Most of us consume bitter through hops, which is in beer, or chocolate, or coffee. But the bitter taste is also in all the greens, right? Dandelion, kale, all the greens, which we'll have in our soup recipe. But the astringent taste is things that you can find in pomegranate and persimmon. And astringent is a very interesting thing. It helps, it has that air and ether element in itself. So it can be aggravating if it's, you know, depending on your body type, but I love that they're seasonal right now, right? So one of the things we think about from an Ayurvedic standpoint is to try to attune ourselves to fruits and vegetables that are occurring seasonally. I know many of you already do that, but just to point out that these things are seasonally. Pomegranates are really in season right now. This is a big time where they're ripening. And same, I believe, with the persimmons. But when you think about this particular recipe, it's really rich in flavonoids and vitamin C. So again, we're thinking about recipes that can help support the body through the cough, cold, immune-challenged season, right? And so this is one, I recently made this up, and I love putting fresh herbs. So again, another thing from Ayurvedic standpoint is we like to put lots of herbs and flavors into recipes. So this has some fresh mint, and I'm gonna put that together here in a minute. And then our last recipe is, and of course we could dive way into all the micronutrients and benefits, but this is what I call a 6-taste yellow dal soup. And this is a soup that is made with mung beans, which are, from the Ayurvedic standpoint, considered very easy to digest. So if your digestion is sluggish, people often reference having mung beans as an option. And these are small yellow dal. You have to kind of specifically look for it. It's not always in every supermarket. You can get it online or at Indian markets. You can substitute red lentils for this, but other legumes might not work quite as effectively. But this recipe actually has a wonderful variety of flavors, as we're going to look at here in a minute. So I wanted to just offer you, as we're closing in here, and then we're going to do some food elements, is this process of transformation and qualities of how we intake and transform what we're given in our life. If you remember this wheel that exists around us of data points, information that's coming in, some of it's literally coming in through the breath, through chemicals that are in the air, through the food we eat. We also are bringing data points in from how we exercise, the company we eat. Remembering that in some way, all of that is being transformed within our being and either walking us towards health or away from health. And appreciating that something that seemingly would be healthy for one might not be healthy for another. And so the uniqueness of Ayurvedic principles is that it really allows us to, the precision model on to the nines, right? So we start thinking about how we're going to be able to individualize and not generalize. And I have a particular passion for this when it comes to women's health, and the lack of understanding of the differences in hormonal health for women is just epically problematic. So women sort of suffer so much alone as these hormonal shifts are happening through menopause, through perimenopause, through childbearing, and appreciating that from an Ayurvedic standpoint, we would have really different approaches to hormonal health that really can deeply nourish. And when those hormones, circadian rhythm, autonomic, all of those things are functioning nicely, is when we can serve and be present for the life we're here to be and who we're here to be. And that, I think, is the beauty of Ayurveda, is that it's giving you that manual. Remember that little baby picture of me? It's like, where's the manual? I'm going to mess this up real good before I get it right. So, learn from, maybe I carry a little of the burden and give you some tips today of things you could learn and incorporate in. And so I always like to point out that maze, that labyrinth that we're in life can be so confusing. But Ayurveda has given me a beautiful compass, and hopefully you can see that it's nothing that doesn't have science or overlap with what's happening in modern innovation. And if you wanted to study more, certainly reach out to me. There's different programs and opportunities. As I mentioned, I do mentor physicians, but there are other pathways that you could choose if you aren't a physician. So I'm happy to support you. And of course, last but not least, no one is to get an A+ on their achievement of this. This comes back to that mindset of, I got to do it all today. Be gentle. I want everyone to have a C- based on the information I've given you, because A+ takes us to burnout, and we are a culture thriving in burnout at the moment. And so, this is your opportunity to just exhale. You've received a lot of information. And now we're going to do some fun cooking. But as I mentioned, here's how you can find me if you haven't. My website, the blog, and I am on Instagram, and some of you may already be connected with me there. Okay, so super excited here to share with you. This is a really fun setup.
Oh, fun. Look at you.
Yeah, it's like, ooh. Okay, so what we've got here are what I like to call sort of these core foods that you'll find in an Ayurvedic diet. And we also are thinking about nourishing the 6 tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, pungent, and astringent. And I'm just going to go through this. So, and for those of you that don't know, dal loves to boil up and over. So let this be like a quick and brief. So everything I own, it has turmeric on it. So be warned if you dive into sort of this, this style of cooking. If you have marble or granite countertops, turmeric stains. And permanently, usually. Sometimes a little lemon and salt will bring it out, but just being mindful if you're bringing some of these ingredients into your home that you haven't cooked with before, that it can be, it also will, the way the rice and the dal combine, they often boil over if they're not being stirred or the heat is just a little bit too high. So let's talk a little bit about this 6 taste recipe. So what we have here are, now, the fun thing about this particular recipe is that, I love this, hello. Okay, so let's do that. There we go. My husband's always joking. I used to do a lot of live cooking during the pandemic. It's to like entertain people, like, hi, day number 3002. So, here we are. And I would just be like a comedy of errors in the kitchen. And so I do have I have a Facebook group, Creating Your Plant-Based Kitchen with Dr. Siri where there's live recordings in there too, and YouTube, whatever, any rate. So when we look at this 6 taste yellow dal soup, this is sort of like, I don't know, for those of you that like to go to the gym, this is like squats, right? This is something that if you can bring it in your life on the regular, it's going to be a good thing for you. So it's not a soup or a recipe that's meant to be like once a month or try it once a season. It's really something that's meant to be integrated pretty regularly into the diet. And this is partly how you're able to nourish that ember to the fire. This is theoretically, the way this is cooked and the way it's prepared and what's in it, relatively easy to digest. And it's often given in Indian families when you're sick. It's called khichdi, a version of this. And so you may have heard that term. It's khichdi cleanses. I've seen that about, you'll see that. But this mung dal and basmati rice are just very nourishing, easy to digest. Some people have a little bit of issues with the certain families of legumes or with grains. You can put other grains into it. It's a slightly different taste, a different flavor. But you're welcome to do that. These are things that, when I think about recipes, I think about them as creative inspirations and roadmaps, if you will, but not necessarily the final destination. So you get to explore with your own kitchen, with seasonality, with spices, what's going to taste best to you. The basis for this recipe is the mung dal and the basmati, and then I use I think I have it here, veggie stock, but you can use water. And the coconut milk gives a little bit creamier, a little bit more calorie dense. So if you're looking to not have as many calories, you can omit the coconut. But it also, in the winter and fall season, coconut is very nourishing. It gives a sense of fullness and satiety when you eat. But we also have, in the mix here of this soup, are these wonderful vegetables that are mostly, like the bitter greens are available all through the winter season. We have leeks. I put in some sweet potatoes. I have some zucchini I'm going to cut in a second. I actually put a little bit of asparagus because it just looked good. And a lot of times that's the beauty of these recipes is that more vegetables will not hurt the recipe. And so, sometimes you look at it and it's like, it's not like making macaroons, right? Has anyone made macaroons? Like, okay, hello. I've tried to make vegan macaroons, which is like pure exercise and frustration. But this quality of appreciating that this recipe is very malleable, it's very flexible. And you can spend a lot of time cutting your vegetables, but you can also do something like this, which is meal prep. And when you come home from the farmer's market or from Sprouts or wherever, Whole Foods, and it adds this wonderful quality of having some veggies ready in the fridge. From the Ayurvedic standpoint, we might think about it in the context of, best to have it freshly cut and freshly cooked. But at the same time, I'm just really practical. I'm a doctor and busy, and most of you are busy and have constraints on your schedule. So we're going to put in a little bit of zucchini as well. And there's carrots and sweet potatoes. So what I'm going to do is run into the kitchen, or we can just dump all that in. Okay. There's also ginger. So when we think about the 6 tastes, bitter is the greens. There's some saffron in it, which is astringent. You can also put celery. Sweet is the sweet potato and carrots. Sour is the citrus that we put on at the end. Sweet, sour, salty. There's some salt and or soy sauce or Bragg's that you can put into the recipe. Bitter is the greens, and pungent is the ginger, and the astringent is the celery, or we also have some saffron. So you start to see that you can have all 6 of these tastes in the meals that you eat, and in some ways that can be very nourishing. So this is a fun recipe. We're hoping it's going to be done for us to enjoy. Let's talk about this other recipe here for a second.
Can I just ask you one thing? So I noticed there's no garlic and there's no almonds, no
Yes.
onion. No onion.
Yes.
Is that a thing?
It is a thing. Yes. Yes. And so what I come back to is just determining your own constitution. So the alums are heating for the pitta predominant person. And also in Ayurvedic cooking, everything has a role. Everything has a quality. And the alums are considered, they're in the ground, they're in the earth. They're considered very grounding. And sometimes with people who want to meditate deeply or kind of experience deep meditative states, you want not as much of that earth element in the diet. And so that's the easiest way I could explain why they're not as present. I believe they have a lot of health benefit. And I always encourage people, if you want them, add them. No harm. My mother-in-law, my husband's Punjabi, everything has garlic and onion. So the other thing I notice for myself is they also are in that fermentable fiber family. So if we think of a FODMAP diet, these things, sometimes people who have digestive troubles, these fermentable fibers can be a little harder to digest. And so if we're thinking about this particular dish as a reset, we're just kind of giving the gut, the microbiome, a little bit of a rest. But it's a wonderful question, and I always encourage people, if you need more of that like kick in the dish, try adding more of the spices that are here, particularly the ginger. You may find that it meets your palate in an unexpected way, but you can definitely add garlic and red onion, yellow onion if you like. Sometimes in that circumstance though, I might lightly saute them in a broth or whatever your preferred method is to just sweeten them a little bit. So if you saute the onions before you add all the other ingredients, a lot of soups do that actually. The mirepoix, they'll saute them before they add all the wet ingredients. So other questions? Yeah.
Is there a certain broth that you use, or do you make your own?
Little both. So I'm a very pragmatic person, and Trader Joe's has the cheapest vegetable broth organic in town. The supply chain has been a really curious thing. I went into Safeway recently to get vegetable broth, and it was like $4.99, and I was, what? So there's that. And Trader Joe's is a great resource. You can get other things there. Some people don't like the packaging or the oil that's in their pre-made recipes, but I think from a broth standpoint and canned goods, their pricing is really good. As an aside, when I prepare all this and there's all the ends, I will often freeze that and then throw that in the slow cooker with some kombu or seaweed and other spices to make a broth. So it just depends on the rhythm and timing in the kitchen. I also have, it might be on my website, kind of like my ultimate broth recipe that's a pho, the noodle dish recipe. So that one is pretty elaborate, but it's very good. And so it just depends on how much time I have. And for me, being in the kitchen is a really vastly creative and meditative and relaxing. But I've really come to appreciate that that is not true for very many people. Like, not many at all. Like a lot of people, now this room is probably an exception because you're here, this topic, there's a resonance with nourishment and eating and cooking. But that's not like when I go out and teach in larger audiences, I'm always amazed by the fact that first 3 things people say to me is, I don't have time to cook, I don't like to cook, and I don't know how to cook. And I always say, well, pay attention to your thoughts, because they may actually be creating your reality. If those are the beliefs that you're in training, then more than likely that's going to be your outcome. You could entertain a different thought, like, I'm a beginner and I'm finding resources to how to nourish myself, which is really different than saying, I don't know how to cook. So just a long story to your question. I think everyone's a little bit different in their approach in the kitchen. And so if you love being in the kitchen, then making broths makes a lot of sense. You use your scraps, it's very affordable, you can do it overnight in the slow cooker, it's delicious, you can freeze them, you can refrigerate them. Sometimes in the morning, I'll sip a warm broth if I'm just feeling really low energy or low focus, and that works really great. It kind of kindles Agni, kind of like the chai recipe. Yeah.
On that topic, you remember the one where you said ideally try not to have anything for the first hour?
Yeah.
You wait. Does that include liquids?
No, so liquids are usually okay. And I'm a big proponent of hydrating. From the Ayurvedic standpoint, we might recommend hydrating with a little bit of lemon water or ginger. If you think about that first hour, and again, nothing is hard and fast. If you notice that if you do the tea in the first hour, other than say just starting with some water, and you notice like, oh, that didn't really work. My energy was lower, my focus was lower, then it wasn't maybe the right tea, the right time, different variables could be at work. But typically in the morning, we want to sort of hydrate the system. And so from an Ayurvedic standpoint, there are a myriad of teas that you could embrace in the morning. My favorite is ginger turmeric. I mean, pretty much most days, I'll start with ginger turmeric tea. I get it in tea bags. I make it from scratch, depending on how busy I am. So, and if we've made the chai, I'll have that.
But the chai is fine with like your
Yeah,
milk?
yeah, I think so. That's my opinion. Now, some of the nut milks, they're different. So oat milk can be a little bit more calorie dense because of the way it's made, and higher in carbs. So, read the labels, add less if you notice a little blood sugar spike. Sometimes
soy.
Soy's a good one. The West soy is nice, the organic West soy. It's just water and soy. It's the unsweetened one. And so, they're all a little bit different. It doesn't. Yeah, perfect.
Thank you.
We didn't plan that, by the way. I was like, what soy milk do we have as I'm speaking? Yes.
Just a quick question. With the chai, would you drink that? Would you keep it in the refrigerator for the next day, or would you toss it at the end of the day?
I would keep it. I do keep it. The ingredients are expensive, and so the question was, would you keep the chai if you don't finish it? And again, from an Ayurvedic standpoint, we try to match what we've eaten, what we're preparing to eat that day. However, I am very realistic. Sometimes you are busy, and batch cooking is a good thing, and it's different than going. So let's say you have in your head, my morning rhythm is a little bit of an invigorating drink, and you made your chai the day before, but you were being, I have to get rid of it at the end of the day, right? This Ayurvedic paradigm. But then the next morning, you don't have anything there, and you're on your way to work, and you're like, how about that Starbucks mocha latte with like, everything, the chai that's like 800 calories, right? And you do that instead, right? See how I see this plays out, right? We're not living in this idyllic, what would be considered sort of ashram or off-the-grid life where your world can kind of integrate seamlessly into these principles. We're in the modern world, and the terminology we use is householder, meaning we're having jobs, children, busy lives. And because of that, we can be adaptable and not aim for that A+ reality. But it's such a great point, is that this is a slightly abstract principle that's held in Ayurveda, but that the vitality, the prana, the most amount of value given to us is in the first day. So again, it's kind of variable. It'll be different for everyone, their beliefs around that. But yeah, other questions? Yeah.
Okay, so this is so cool. I'm so into it. What would be like the next steps for someone to do? You see a practitioner? Do you go to a retreat? Like what?
Oh gosh, love this question. So yeah, all of it. So I would say the best first step is to not this would have been my, like looking back for me, would be to find a practitioner and to really work with them one-to-one. Do you take clients? Yeah, so we have an Ayurvedic practitioner here in the audience. If anyone is interested in working with someone, raise your hand, yeah. So feel free to connect. And, but I think that, the question is, how do you invite more Ayurvedic insight and knowledge into your life? And the dilemma is that you can't superimpose what we know from the Western paradigm easily. More is not better in some circumstances. What works for one may not work for another. And I truly believe that the therapeutic relationship is medicinal in its own right. It offers a therapeutic benefit. It's not often spoken of, but the co-regulation, the nervous system regulation that happens from these extended visits, because an Ayurvedic practitioner intake could be 60 to 90 minutes and could explore many aspects of your life. And so there's a website, NAMA, the National Ayurvedic Medical Association, and you can look up practitioner database there as well.
And what does that look like when you first start?
Yeah. So in an Ayurvedic, so the question was, what would it look like when you first start going? So the first thing that's going to happen is it's actually called a Rugnapatrikam, which is actually this very elaborate intake that looks at literally like, do you have a thing on your toenail that's splintered? Like, there's many diagnostic technical pieces. The eyes are looked at, the tongue is looked at, the palm is looked at. Some might include even the astrology. I guess that's more abstract. But the first visit is really as much an intake, and then the practitioner is digesting, and often it's a very simple initial recommendation. And usually it's 6 to 12 months of a therapeutic relationship to really see. And Dr. Ladd always used to say to us, Ayurveda is not a quick fix. It's not the same as taking a medication. It's not the same as an immersive process. Now, that having been said, there are some immersive retreats, and there's something called Panchakarma, Pancha being 5, karma being actions. And Panchakarma is the deep cleanse retreat. And a lot of people go to India for that from the affordability standpoint. But there are also places around the US that offer that. A lot of, sorry?
There's a place in LA.
Yeah, there's places in LA. There's different places where you can go. I always encourage people, there are Vaidyas, which are the Ayurvedic physicians that will do it sort of one-to-one. You go stay where they are. There's several in LA. There's one in Houston. But it just depends on how deep the issue you're looking at and working at. Inevitably, you do all of it, as Pam, right? Clea said, yeah. So eventually you explore all of it. And at least if you are sort of, stepping into it. So, yeah. Other questions? Other questions? Okay. So this is this other recipe here. And this is a pomegranate persimmon with some ginger and lime. And we just have this wonderful fresh mint that we can put into it. And the mint has been rinsed. And a lot of times we say with the Ayurvedic qualities that the energy of our being, it goes into the food. So sometimes if you hand tear the herbs, it kind of has a different quality than if you put it with your knife. So oftentimes when I cook for people, I'll just have a thought of love. I want this to nourish you. I want this food to be something that your body accepts with ease. Like you can bring that prayer into food. I believe that. My life has taught me that. We don't learn that in Western nutrition, though. So.
Personal journey, just out of curiosity, happens by first going to India and being exposed, or going to India to be exposed?
Going to India to be exposed. So I started the Ayurvedic study when I was in college, and then I pined away for 15 more years before I was invited, as I like to say, to be in India. So 2008 was the first time I got to go to India to study, and I went to Coimbatore and studied in a small school there. And then in 2011 to 14, I studied with Dr. Ladd. And then a couple of other trips to India in the interim that kind of, yeah, those are long stories. So I always am pretty transparent. Like my healing journey has been very complex. I don't just land here accidentally. I've had a lot of health issues. And And I always say, sometimes that's just the way it is. We would love a perfect body, we'd love perfect health, but that's not in the cards. And so, embrace the acceptance of this body is doing the very best it can with all the variables I've given it. And medical school was really hard on me. And being in allopathic practices, I was always a little bit of an odd bird. So, okay, so that is the salad, and we've got this chai. And, all right. So we're gonna let you all come up and sample here. So we can put in some, I think one will have the milk in front of it will be soy milk. I know some people don't do soy. So again, you can put as much or as little milk as you like. I'm gonna do sort of a middle of the road pour. All right. I always like to say these are sort of Trader Joe's nibbles, like not fully a lunch, not a full meal, but enough to get a little bit of a taste. Yeah.